Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Age of the American Revolution, Part 1. This is the first half of our video lecture now, on the American Revolution. We have to remember that the way the story is traditionally told makes it seem as if the English colonists, that is, those colonists residing in the 13 colonies of North America, were simply biding their time until they could declare independence and become free. That sort of heritage story, looking back to see the germ of liberty, developing into full-fledged independence, really blinds us to the fact that nothing was inevitable whatsoever. Certainly not an American Revolution, certainly not an American independence. These people were, after all, in their own minds and in the minds of those who governed them, colonists in an empire, a vast empire of England that stretched not only across the 13 colonies, but Canada and the West Indies and globally as well. This was a point of pride for most. To be part of the British Empire was to be part of perhaps the greatest military and economic empire in history. And certainly the fact of life was that the interests of empire would have to be defended in a competitive, hotly contested imperial theater such as North America, that the claims of empire would have to be defended. And thus military conflicts were a fact of life. The artist Benjamin West famously depicted the death of the British General Wolfe during the British attack on Quebec in 1759, part of an ongoing conflict between Britain and France over territorial rights, including Canada. The British attack on Quebec in 1759 saw not only the death of this British general, but the tightening, if you will, of tensions, the growing conflict between the two imperial nations over their various and competing land claims in North America. And this was now the context in which the English colonists, especially those living in New England, in the northern part of the 13 colonies, will be inexorably drawn into these conflicts, these larger imperial conflicts on the side of the British. A British naval squadron, along with 4,500, that is 4,500 colonial volunteers, had some years earlier succeeded in capturing the French fortress at Louisbourg, which was a fortress on the St. Lawrence Seaway, the gateway, you might say, to French Canada from the Atlantic Ocean. This attack by the British, along with their colonial supporters, many of them New England farm boys, militiamen, in 1745, cemented those ties to the British Empire. This was a matter of patriotism for these young colonialists, these young subjects of the British Crown. And as subjects, they rejoiced at the victory over the hated French, though England later agreed to return the fortress to French possession. The conflicts will continue and will inspire patriotic solidarity between the English colonists and the mother country. North America itself represented a complex landscape of imperial rivalry throughout the Atlantic world. If you look at this map, you see the potential for conflict, from French to British to Spanish to hybrid claims. The French and Spanish interests, along with their colonial native allies. Don't forget that the native peoples of North America, themselves diverse, sometimes unified, often divided, became players in this imperial game as well, and competed with the British and their colonial interests, along with these native allies, did the American colonists. So complex tapestry, but one that was given meaning by British identity. Native people in particular seem to hold the balance in these imperial rivalries. It's easy to see the Indians as simply pawns in a larger imperial game, but far from that being the case, they were often critical players in the fortunes of European imperial expansion, as they dominated, the native people dominated the forest passages between the rival empires. As an English trader put it in 1755, the importance of the Indians is now generally known and understood. A doubt remains not that the prosperity of our colonies on the continent will stand or fall with our interest and favor among them. While they are our friends, they are the cheapest and strongest barrier for the protection of our settlements. When enemies, they are capable of ravaging in their method of war, in spite of all we can do to render those possessions almost useless. So an English trader in 1755 acknowledging the critical part played by native peoples throughout the North American landscape as go-betweens, as partners, as allies, and sometimes as enemies in the imperial game of territorial expansion between the French, the British, and the Spanish. Native peoples certainly made their own decisions about who to support and who to oppose, and that included their own alliances and rivalries with one another. This English sketch here shows the famous Iroquois, that is the people we know as the Haudenosaunee, or otherwise known as the Iroquois, who actually are being a confederation of tribes, of 6 different tribes, presented a solidarity, if you will, a solidified front to the British and the French, and became critical partners in the imperial game. The 6-nation Iroquois made up of the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora peoples who had confederated in an alliance long before the arrival of the British, now, as I say, offered a united or solidified front in a critical area of upstate New York and New England. Critical area, that is an area critical to the land claims of the British and even the French. It was the Iroquois who controlled that corridor between French Canada and British New York, for example. And as one New York colonist put it in 1746, it was on whose side ever the Iroquois Indians fall, they will cast the balance. They will cast the balance. As you can see from the portrait here, the Iroquois had integrated into their traditional cultures the technologies and ways of the Europeans, including their weapons, their gunpowder weapons and firearms. But in terms of numbers, in terms of sheer numbers, the English held the advantage over their French rivals with more than 1.5 million colonists, compared to only about 70,000 French colonists in North America by the 1750s. The sheer weight of numbers here is tilting the advantage toward the British. Yet the French often had better relations with the native peoples and treated them with diplomatic respect, generous presence, and hospitality. Said John Lawson, settler of Carolina, "We look upon them with scorn and disdain and think them little better than beasts in human shape." Thus was often the British view. The English no sooner get possession of a country than the game is forced to leave, the trees fall down before them, the earth becomes bare. So a delicate balance of power often gave way to shifting interests, and English colonists were usually deeply embroiled in the conflicts that followed. Here we see 2 images of the younger George Washington, first as a surveyor representing Virginia's western land claims, and also as a colonel in the Virginia militia. On 2 occasions, Washington was involved in military clashes with the French while surveying and reconnoitering in western territories. Famously, in the example of Fort Duquesne, the young Washington was actually taken prisoner for a bit by the French and told to deliver a message to his English patrons that the French would suffer no encroachment by English settlers into the territory of the Ohio River. It was a humbling chastisement for the young Washington, one that he never forgot. By the 1750s, England was at war with France, as we saw earlier in the portrait of General Wolfe, and decided to invest heavily in North American military maneuvers. In other words, the English will dig in. And by 1760, the French were on the verge of surrendering all of their territorial possessions in North America. This had come at great cost, however. By 1758, 45,000 troops, about half of them British regulars and half of them colonial volunteers, faced fewer than 10,000 French troops in what came to be called the French and Indian War, which was part of the larger 7 Years' War that extended back across the Atlantic to the European continent. This was basically a war for empire in North America between Britain, primarily, and France. But it was Britain, along with her colonial allies, that would turn the tide in this long and expensive war. Victory brought England a new scale of empire, certainly. As you can see from the map here, from the 13 colonies now, an enormous new territorial empire added to the British claims as a result of their victory over the French. At a price tag of £4 million to secure Canada, 10 times what the French had spent to defend it, by the way. A huge new region to secure from future attacks by French, Spanish, and Indians. If it was costly to win this territory, it would be even more costly to administer and maintain it. To defend it would be an enormous debt. In fact, the total English debt from 73 million to 137 million pounds by the end of the war, financed largely by private loans from European banks. The interest payments alone on these loans consumed 60% of England's budget by the 1760s. So yes, imperial victory, but dramatic new burdens, financial and otherwise, on the island nation of England to maintain and secure what it had won through war from the French. Following the French and Indian War, the English faced a large-scale rebellion. For the first time, large numbers of native tribes joined together in a confederation to fight the English out on the western frontier. During the spring of 1763, in raids all along that colonial frontier, the Ohio Valley and Mississippi River Valley, native people killed or captured about 2,000 colonists. Here you can see a map of that frontier region that ran basically from the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley all throughout this northwestern part of the Mississippi River Basin. The attitudes of colonists hardened toward the native people, especially those who were migrating beyond the Appalachian Range into these new regions, new for them, of the Ohio River and Mississippi River basins. And this created untold administrative challenges for the British Crown to try and secure the peace, to put down a rebellion, to manage boundaries was a full-time proposition now for this upstart empire, Great Britain. In fact, so serious an administrative challenge and financial challenge did the British face that they realized that an entire overhaul of English imperial administrative practices was necessary to make the large colonial empire more cost-effective and easier to administer. And one of the critical decisions, one of the critical reforms introduced by Parliament in England was known as the Proclamation of 1763, designed to create an orderly process of Western land settlement while reassuring the native peoples that their own territorial boundaries would be respected. 10,000 regular soldiers, it was estimated, would have to be stationed in forts along the perimeter. You see the proclamation line of 1763, right in the heart of this Mississippi Basin. this Great Lakes, Ohio River, and Mississippi Basin. 10,000 regular soldiers would have to be stationed in a chain of forts along the perimeter just to protect the English colonial land claims. Yet the edict, that is the proclamation itself, proved very unpopular among colonists who felt that English victory in the French and Indian War, an English victory in which 45,000 colonial troops and militiamen had participated, they felt that this victory would open up Western territories to further colonial settlement and investment. For example, you see Virginia here, George Washington's colony. Washington was, as we say, apprehended twice by the French while doing surveying and mapping of Virginia's western claims. Virtually each of the 13 English colonies in possessing their own colonial charters had included in those charters dramatic claims. Remember, this territory was not particularly well known to the British. They were not especially familiar with the true extent of the North American continent, and some of these colonial charters simply referenced western lands stretching to the sea, not realizing that that was 3,000 miles across the North American continent. So yeah, each of them made their own peculiar land claims in the West here and meant to cash in on them, both as territory to be bought and sold, parcels to be bought and sold on a commercial market, but also as a place for their own colonial settlers to now to homestead, that is, to migrate to and to homestead. So the proclamation of 1763 was quite unpopular among the colonists because they saw it as a restriction. Desperate to maintain good relations with the native peoples of this region, the British sought to tie off or at least control the spread of colonial settlement there, which was always an antagonism to the native people. And the proclamation line of 1763 then was to be the boundary, something that upset the colonists a great deal. And this was just the beginning. Other measures necessary from an administrative and financial standpoint, according to the English perspective, other measures taken in victory would now inspire continued colonial hostility and resistance among the colonists. Probably most famously in 1765 was the famous Stamp Act issued by Parliament in that year as a revenue measure. It would be the first to touch off protests throughout the colony. And you see the embossed 1 penny stamp here that was to be placed now on all paper goods, all paper transactions, postal transactions, but also purchases, retail purchases of everything from writing paper to playing cards would be embossed with the colonial 1 penny tax and the stamp that would signify the tax being paid. Yeah, and across the colonies, outrage, protests. We're talking now popular protests in the streets, the burning of stamped paper, for example, by the colonists to show their displeasure of what they considered to be an invalid revenue measure. Invalid because it was passed by Parliament 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. And we'll see in part two of this lecture, touching off a heated debate over various political claims, colonial versus parliamentary claims, claims of self-government over imperial government and such, would form now the channel through which the constitutional debates would play out. Constitutional debates that in the beginning were framed very much by the colonists as a means of asserting their rights as English colonists, not as simple precursors to the declaring of independence, because no one was really calling for independence. They were simply calling for their rights as Englishmen, as they understood them, to be respected by the home government. And so a conservative resistance, you might say, in constitutional terms, to reassert and to defend rights they felt they had always had, and far from the minds of most was any intentioned call for independence, let alone revolution. So, to see how this rather limited but volatile protest, inspired by English reforms, to see how it eventually morph, how it would transform into something revolutionary, we'll come back to part two of this lecture.